She pressed play at 3:07 a.m., and the room filled with a voice she had trusted for 15 years, making plans for how to erase her. Margaret sat on the edge of her sofa in the Houston penthouse she had helped furnish, earbuds in, the glow of the city painting the ceiling. The suitcase had been under the bed, Andrew's last-minute packing before a business trip, and when she unzipped it, she found something he'd never meant her to touch, a small digital recorder wedged beside a travel-sized bottle of cologne. Someone had thought to whisper into it. Someone had thought some things could stay private. But that night, the whisper was a blueprint. If you believe in justice for the betrayed, subscribe. The invitation was small and odd. It was the kind of practical, quiet thing Margaret would have posted if she'd been telling the story on her terms. Instead, she tilted forward and rewound the audio, listening with the sort of attention she had once given to furniture samples and client pitches. The voice was unmistakably his, measured, almost clinical, mapping dates and accounts, referencing a prenup clause like it was a strategic maneuver rather than a covenant between people. A woman's laugh punctuated the plan, a hotel and a calendar date. The word beneficiary said with blunt, businesslike certainty. At first, the betrayal that cut through her was not the personal, torrid kind the tabloids trade in. It was logistical. The recording was not a confession of feeling. It was a ledger of intent. They discussed timing to make transfers look routine, to change the life insurance designation at the precise moment his option vesting would be least scrutinized. They mapped how to portray a marriage that had grown apart. Irreconcilable differences, a lawyer would say, while quietly moving assets away from her. They named numbers and accounts. They counted on the prenup to be the lock they could pick. She sat very still. The apartment hummed, the refrigerator, a distant freeway. Outside, the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows reflected a woman who had been told she was unstable the night she insisted Andrew admit the freezing text messages, the night he called her paranoid. Inside, Margaret rewound the recording again, this time to the moment where a name, Vanessa, was mentioned as the beneficiary. She paused the audio and let the silence expand until it hurt. This was no sudden affair of passion. It was a plan that had been constructed with spreadsheets. She did not scream. She did not throw the suitcase into the hall. She did what women in stories of cold calculation do not always get credit for. She made a list. The list was practical. Copy the recording, photograph everything, locate the safe deposit box papers, find the prenup, verify the life insurance policy, call Thomas. Thomas arrived before dawn, carrying a briefcase and the kind of calm that comes from seeing legal chaos as a puzzle to be solved. In the kitchen, over black coffee, Margaret handed him the recorder with hands that had stopped trembling enough to be useful. She told a condensed version of the last 15 years, how she'd postponed a promising interior design career to support Andrew when he took a demanding role at Richfield Energy, how she hosted fundraising dinners that he listed on LinkedIn as networking, how she had ghostwritten speeches he credited to himself at shareholder meetings. She spoke of their prenup, negotiated in the quiet, a clause inserted by his counsel years before that limited community claims on unvested stock options and hedged against what he insisted was prudence. I signed because he insisted it would avoid future fights, she said. It felt like a structural thing, protections for both of us. I never once imagined he would use it as a map to cut me out. Thomas listened, then went through the motions lawyers are taught to do. He photographed, he cataloged, he copied. The recorder was saved twice, on separate thumb drives, with checksum markers he explained in plain language. A way to demonstrate the time and integrity of a file, should anyone later question whether it had been altered. The suitcase was photographed as found. The apartment was documented, a chain of custody that began with Margaret's hand and would move through professional hands from then on. They went to the bank. The safe deposit box was small and densely packed, insurance papers, a stack of crystalline photographs of their early years, stock option statements, and, folded into an envelope marked in Andrew's precise hand, the prenup documents. One footnote caught Margaret's eye, a clause she had never fully parsed about beneficiaries and contingent assignments in case of separation. It was legalese, but it mattered. Among the papers, a recent change of beneficiary form bore a date 2 months earlier. The intended beneficiary was Vanessa Chun, who Margaret knew only as Andrew's assistant from holiday gatherings, where she'd smiled in a way that always looked rehearsed. "You didn't see this," Thomas said. "Not yet." Margaret had seen it. She had lived the moments that led to that form becoming a weapon. She had been present at fundraising dinners where Andrew explained company strategy in ways that made investors lean forward. She had been the face at home smoothing out the edges, the networker, the partner, the one who made possible the seamless public Andrew. The prenup and the beneficiary change were the legal scaffolding for what she now realized had been a deliberate plan to make her invisible. They returned to the penthouse with copies of everything. Thomas made a call to a former colleague of his who knew how to protect evidence. That colleague recommended Patricia Reeves, no nonsense, former FBI investigator turned private investigator. When Patricia walked in, she had an identification badge clipped to a lanyard, even though she no longer needed to show it. She moved with a certainty that made Margaret feel steadier. Patricia listened to the recording once, then twice, then nodded. "This is organized," she said. "Not incidental. That's not how people talk in passion. This is a timeline, an operation." What followed was methodical. Patricia explained, in Margaret's ear, the contours of what would make a private betrayal into more than a marital dispute, what would push it past prenups and into the jurisdiction of boards, accountants, and prosecutors. "It's not the affair that matters to the law," she said. "It's the money, and whether someone has misused corporate funds or made fraudulent transfers designed to deprive a spouse, and potentially whether company assets were diverted." Margaret had always thought financial betrayal would look like a late-night withdrawal or an unexplained purchase. Instead, Patricia's investigation sketched the shape of modern skullduggery. Small, legal-appearing transfers into consultancy accounts, expense reports that matched hotel charges with coded line items, credit cards paid under different names. It was petty enough to evade suspicion and clever enough to create plausible deniability. Patricia set to work with a checklist: get a full credit card ledger, pull travel receipts, subpoena hotel rosters if possible, archive social media posts and geotags, interview HR contacts at Richfield Energy about Vanessa's rapid promotion. She also emphasized a quiet legal step that Margaret had not considered. Time is critical. If assets were being shifted to avoid claims, immediate legal action could freeze those moves. "We don't bluff here," Patricia said. "We collect, and then we move." For 2 weeks, Margaret and her team were ghosts in a city full of light. Margaret resumed a kind of business as usual in public: coffee meetings, a charity board luncheon, a dinner with a client looking for a retrofit, while private men with subpoena power and courtroom experience rummaged through the seams of her life. She learned to compartmentalize, design meetings by day, forensic accounting briefings after 10. The design studio, where she had once been the rising star, now lived in her laptop. Emails she drafted from an office she rarely visited. When clients asked if everything was all right, she responded with a practiced smile and a promise to phone back. In truth, she was learning the grammar of evidence. Patricia's first deliverables were small but telling. A credit card bill showing multiple charges at boutique hotels during Andrew's so-called business trips, each of them under a corporate expense code and flagged with oddly phrased memos. Hotel receipts listed a room for 2 at several hotels where Andrew's corporate card had been used, and a pattern emerged. Bookings at independent properties where staffless check-ins would limit paper trails. A set of dinner charges labeled as client entertainment matched dates where social media posts showed Vanessa in cities away from Houston, the photos geotagged and time-stamped. If he's billing these through expense accounts, that's potentially misuse of company funds, Patricia said. If there's an agreement to conceal payments to a third party, that edges into conspiracy notions. But first we prove the link. Card to Trip, Trip to Vanessa, Trip to Statements. Meanwhile, Thomas was building a legal map. He explained the contours of the prenup in clear terms, what it protected, what it didn't, and where the law looked beyond private agreements into torts and crimes. The prenup might limit Margaret's claim to unvested options. It did not, and could not, legitimize fraudulent conduct. If company money had been used to benefit Vanessa personally, or if Andrew had authorized transfers to shell entities to hide value, those moves could violate corporate rules and state laws. You can consent to a contract, Thomas said, but you can't consent to being defrauded. They began to notice small, crystalline signals in corporate filings. Public statements showed accelerated promotions with perfunctory explanations. Internal HR notes, leaked to Margaret by an anonymous tip Patricia cultivated, referred to a strategic support role that skirted descriptions of responsibility. Vanessa's title had subtly evolved in less than a year, and along with it came expense privileges and an unusual access to Andrew's calendar that allowed her to be on trips that would later be coded as company necessary. The pattern told a story that a single receipt could not. One night, when Margaret could no longer maintain the split life, she went back to the recordings. There were names and numbers she had not caught at first, account suffixes, an email handle that belonged to a consulting firm Andrew had once mentioned approvingly at a board meeting. Patricia cross-referenced and found a small Chicago company with a deceptively generic name, Crescent Advisory, registered to an address that, when visited, had been a mailbox in a co-working space. The firm's filings showed recent deposits from accounts that matched the ones named in the recording. Forensic accounting will make the link, Patricia said. We trace the path of funds. Money moves leave traces, wire confirmations, corporate ledgers, expense reimbursements. Those are records. They don't talk, but they don't lie. Forensic accounting is a phrase Margaret had heard before in true crime documentaries. It sounded like a lab technique. Patricia explained it simply. Accountants who follow the money like detectives follow footprints. They match invoices to bank transfers, emails authorizing payments to the ledgers that clear them. Where a normal audit looks for compliance, forensics looks for deception. If funds were routed to benefit Vanessa personally, or to conceal a pattern of dissipation meant to reduce Margaret's claim, those accountants would find it. The first forensic summary arrived 3 weeks in, a color-coded spreadsheet with arrows and columns. It showed a series of transfers out of a corporate-managed account into a vendor account in the names of innocuous-sounding companies, followed by disbursements to an individual account linked to Vanessa's name. Some transactions were masked with vague descriptions, consulting fee, project expense, but timestamps and corresponding emails suggested coordination. There was also a set of charges directly tied to Andrew's corporate card that had been reimbursed as client entertainment, but that correlated to hotel stays and dinners, where Vanessa's social media showed her in the same city and the same hour. Margaret read the spreadsheet until the lines blurred. Each arrow was a small betrayal, each cell a humiliation she could have borne if it had been a secret. Multiplied, the pattern became a plan. The forensic sheet did not say guilty. It said, link established. It said that if the chain of custody of these documents could be maintained, if backup receipts, emails, and witness accounts could be authenticated, then a strong case could be presented to the corporate board, and if the board found misuse, to a prosecutor. You're not doing this to humiliate him, Patricia reminded her. You're doing it to stop the bleeding and protect what's rightfully yours. A board will act if there's credible evidence. Prosecutors will only step in when they see evidence that suggests criminality, embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy. We show them the map, then let the system decide. Margaret slept less, not from anxiety, but from a new focus. She kept a small notebook where she scribbled the moments she wanted preserved, the date she first suspected something unusual at a holiday event, the exact wording Andrew used one night when he dismissed her concern as overly emotional, the time the prenatal schedule he had boasted about in speeches translated into a stock vesting schedule. These fragments would, Thomas said, humanize a ledger. They would show motive and opportunity in human terms. They approached an HR source at Richfield who preferred anonymity. The HR contact confirmed what social media implied. Vanessa's rapid rise had been unusual, but not overtly documented in a way that would have pleased a compliance officer. The contact supplied copies of expense policies, an internal memo about travel reimbursements, and an internal calendar that showed Vanessa inserted in several meetings with vendors. It was circumstantial, but when stitched together with the spending patterns, it began to look like a direct line. Boards respond to risk, Thomas explained when they presented these early findings in a closed meeting. Not to gossip. If you present a board with a credible risk that an officer has misused corporate funds, especially if those funds appear to have been diverted for personal gain, that obligates them to investigate. If they find evidence of misappropriation, they must refer it to regulators or prosecutors. That evening, Margaret took a breath and walked through the penthouse as if she were performing the set of a future deposition. She looked at the dining table where she had hosted donors, at the art that Andrew praised when cameras showed up at their house, at the plant on the balcony that had begun to yellow since she started sleeping less. These were not just objects. In her mind, they were exhibits, the life she had helped build that someone was trying to convert into an argument for her own disposability. Patricia suggested a small relay of immediate actions to ensure nothing moved while they prepared their next legal steps. Copies of bank statements were placed with a trustworthy accountant's firm. Emails were archived with timestamps. Surveillance of Andrew's public movements began, not as voyeurism, but as corroboration. If corporate cards showed hotel charges on specific dates and public photos placed Vanessa at those hotels at those times, the correlation was stronger. They also prepared a letter to the board, concise, factual, non-accusatory, designed to do what shareholders and governance rules demand: trigger an independent review. Still, there was one more discovery that felt like a key turning in a lock. In a manila folder beneath the prenup, tucked between option award letters, someone had slipped a copy of a life insurance beneficiary form, recently altered. The form bore an inked change that moved the primary beneficiary from Margaret to Vanessa on a date that corresponded to a large option vesting milestone. If the change had been authorized by Andrew, the timing looked less like coincidence and more like a deliberate hedging of bets. Ensure a third party benefits if the marriage dissolves, even while the corporate line on a resume painted the marital picture as amicable. It's not criminal by itself, Thomas said when he saw the form. But it's an important piece. If that change resulted from coercion, fraud, or a deceptive act, if the signature is forged, or if corporate funds paid a premium that benefited a third party, then you have a trail to follow. Margaret felt her throat tighten at that particular phrase: coercion, fraud. Her anger was tempered now by strategy. She wanted to be reasonable enough for a judge to hear, forensic enough for an accountant to follow, human enough for jurors to sympathize with. She understood, perhaps more than ever, that vindication in court is less about pyrotechnics and more about maintaining presence of mind. The next phase required a move with precision rather than drama. Thomas drafted a petition that sought, among other things, emergency relief. A temporary restraining order against any transfer of contested assets, an injunction to prevent changes to beneficiaries without mutual consent, and a request that the court order preservation of electronic records. Patricia prepared an evidence binder for the board, a clean, annotated collection of the recording, the change of beneficiary form, the prenup, credit card statements, and the preliminary forensic summary. They rehearsed a short, calm statement Margaret would read if the board allowed her to speak. Factual, devoid of melodrama, pointed toward process rather than retaliation. In the hallway outside her building the morning they planned to file, Margaret stood looking at the city. The sun was low, and the urban heat shimmered. She felt no triumph yet, only a steely kind of resolve she recognized from early morning design consultations and firm board meetings. The plan was to file the petition without warning and serve Andrew at the office. The work of transforming private betrayal into public accountability would not be instantaneous, but it would be deliberate. Patricia cautioned on the mechanics. Serving at the workplace is a legal step that announces a dispute in a place where plenty of colleagues will notice. It can provoke retaliation in office politics, but non-action risks dissipation, transfers, loans, and reimbursements that might evaporate an equitable division. "We serve him at his desk," she said. "We give him notice. We make his board and his council aware. That's where the public becomes a guardrail." Thomas finalized the emergency filing and called his assistant to set the wheels in motion. The documents would be uploaded to the court's electronic filing system. A process server would be hired to make the delivery. Patricia would have a member of her team at the courthouse to ensure the timestamp was recorded. Each of these small bureaucratic acts felt to Margaret like placing a stone in a long, purposeful line. Late in the day, while the legal machinery moved in quiet, Margaret sat with the binder Patricia had prepared. She thought of the recording again, how easily a voice can make a plan concrete. She had the audio saved on several drives. She had the bank papers, the prenup, the beneficiary form. She had accounts trending in suspicious ways. She had witness statements, HR documents, social media geolocation points, hotel receipts. It was a patchwork, but in the hands of the right experts, the fragments became a picture. Yet even with all that, the unknown loomed. Would the board treat the binder as a governance problem or merely a private quarrel? Would a prosecutor see the pattern of transfers as criminal? The path from boardroom inquiry to the criminal docket is not automatic. It requires the right alignment, a finding of misconduct by those with corporate authority, a referral to prosecutors, and then prosecutorial discretion to bring charges. Each step could stall. Each step required clear evidence. When Thomas said, "We do this one step at a time," he did not mean they were slow. He meant they were surgical. That night, Margaret returned to the recording once more. This time she listened not for emotion, but for specific detail, an account number fragment, the sound of a hotel name, the cadence of dates. She transcribed what she could and highlighted the moments that most clearly indicated coordination rather than coincidence. The act of transcription calmed her. Words being written down felt like something that could be argued for in courtrooms and in boardrooms. As the clock approached midnight, her phone buzzed with a short message from Patricia. Forensic team found an off-book transfer, $2.7 million. Pending, need bank auth. Margaret stared at the numbers as if they were an accusation written in neon. $2.7 million. The sum, if confirmed, would not only be significant, it would be a red flag in corporate finance. It would be something a compliance officer could not ignore, and something a prosecutor might find interesting if the board referred it. She closed her eyes and pictured the next morning. A process server in the lobby, the courier carrying the ethics binder to the Richfield board, the hush in conference rooms as compliance counsel read the first page. What she could not imagine yet was the outcome. Would the board respond swiftly? Would they call for an independent audit? Would the chain of custody they had maintained hold up to scrutiny? Would prosecutors be alerted, and, if so, how quickly? Margaret rose and moved through her home like a witness walking the scene before testimony. She straightened a cushion. She adjusted a lamp. She practiced the steady voice she would use to read a short statement, when the board allowed it, about governance risk, company integrity, and the need for an independent review. She would not dramatize. She would not accuse without proof. She would present what they had, and then let the institutions designed to adjudicate these matters do their work. Outside, the city did not pause. Inside, in the quiet of a room full of artifacts of a life built in partnership, Margaret felt the strange, heavy freedom of preparation. The pieces were starting to fit. The problem, the betrayal, had a shape. There was a plan in the recording. There was paper in the safe deposit box. There were receipts, geotags, and a beneficiary form. There was an emerging trail from corporate coffers to vendor accounts to a private beneficiary. She slept that night for an hour or two, and then not at all. Dawn came with a stack of emails, confirmation that the court filing was set, an acknowledgement from a server that he could arrange service at Andrew's office that afternoon, and a terse reply from a law clerk confirming a hearing date for emergency relief. The pieces were moving like clockwork. At 8:45 a.m., Margaret left the penthouse with the binder tucked under her arm. The building elevator hummed, and strangers' small talk filtered in and out like static. She felt exposed and protected at once. Exposed because this was now public. Protected because she had built a chain of custody that would make it difficult for anyone to dismiss what they were about to allege. She was no longer the woman whispered about as unstable when she raised questions. She had the backing of legal process. The courthouse clerk stamped the filing. Patricia's team confirmed the forensic lead had secured preliminary bank authorizations to trace the $2.7 million transfer. Thomas finished a call with a compliance attorney who agreed to accept a sealed ethics submission. The architecture of accountability had begun to creak into motion. On the way to the office where the server would find Andrew, Margaret rehearsed the couple of sentences she would say if she faced him before a crowd of colleagues. "I am here to ensure that company processes are followed and that assets are protected," she would say. "I am asking the board to conduct an independent review." Nothing about it felt like spectacle. It felt like the only reasonable path forward. She stepped into the elevator that took her down to the street. The air outside was brisk, and in the distance the corporate tower where Andrew's office perched like a shard of glass looked the way glass often looks in these stories: cold, reflective, implacable. As they approached the lobby of his building, her phone vibrated. A message from Patricia. "Board counsel has received the initial cover letter. They've scheduled a preliminary review." Another from Thomas. "Server is in place." Margaret's hand tightened around the binder. She thought about the man she had once trusted to build a life with, about the precision with which he had apparently arranged to hedge his public life against private consequences. She thought about how many times people confuse silence for surrender. She had been silent only to collect evidence. When the process server announced that he had served Andrew's counsel at 10:12 a.m., there was a small, contained exhale inside her ribs, the kind of exhale that follows taking a difficult, necessary step. The world does not stop because a life is changing. Emails arrived, protocols began, and the corporate machine rotated to face a new risk. They delivered the ethics binder to Richfield's general counsel shortly after noon. The woman who received the package was all professionalism, an efficient nod, the zip of a file drawer, a promise to look into it. But her face was the face of a person who knows the language of governance: risk, investigation, independent audit. Within hours, the company placed Andrew on administrative leave, pending an internal review, froze certain privileges, and retained an outside counsel to conduct the independent investigation. Moves that were procedural but significant. Such actions did not equate to criminal charges, but they were a public admission that the company took the allegations seriously enough to pause the executive's duties. Margaret watched the headlines start to form in a dozen private inboxes. "Executive on leave as company probes possible misconduct." She did not read the commentary. Her attention was on the chain of custody, the drives that held the recording, the notarized copies of the beneficiary form, the printouts with Patricia's highlights. She felt finally that her life had been given back a measure of agency. And yet, even as the corporate wheels turned, Patricia's team reported a troubling update. Some of the vendor accounts showed reconciliations that suggested funds were not merely being diverted for Vanessa's personal benefit, but were possibly being used to pay down obscure liabilities, to move value in ways that obscured their origin. Activity that, if intentional, could cross from corporate misconduct into criminal conduct. Thomas listened and then said only what he had said before. "We keep the path clean. We document. We let auditors and prosecutors do their work." There was more to come, but Margaret, for the moment, allowed herself to feel something she had not felt since the recordings: clarity. The recording had been a starting pistol. The prenup, the beneficiary form, the forensic spreadsheet, the board action. Each was a step from private hurt toward public remedy. That remedy would not be easy, and it would not be quick. There were legal thresholds to meet, evidentiary burdens to satisfy, and a public relations maelstrom to manage. She walked back into her penthouse as evening settled, the city lights now an audience. The night would be long, the next steps required patience, precision, and the kind of endurance she had cultivated when her design practice demanded late nights and exacting standards. Upstairs, she placed the binder on the table, closed the lid of the laptop that held the transcriptions, and let herself sit in the evidence of her own life. The strategy had shifted from discovery to exposure, from silence to due process. The world had been told a version of Andrew. The recording had told another. Margaret knew how these things played out. Boards could act, compliance could refer, prosecutors might investigate. But between suspicion and a prison cell, there are many steps, investigations, indictments, trials, that require bridges of proof. For now, she had built the first bridge, a chain of documents and witnesses, a forensic path, and the attention of the proper authorities. She did not want vengeance. She wanted truth, and for the truth to be adjudicated in the forum that best fits it. Her plan was to see the investigatory process through, to make sure every piece of evidence was collected and preserved, and to let the institutions designed for accountability do what they were supposed to do. Outside, the city breathed. Inside, the binder waited, thick with annotated documents and highlighted pages. It contained the kind of precision that has toppled careers before. But precision alone does not send a person to jail. It opens the door for authorities to decide whether the evidence crosses the legal threshold for criminal action. Before she turned in for the night, brief, compartmentalized, necessary, Margaret recorded a short note to herself. Stay methodical. Keep chain. Let the law do its work. She saved it on her phone, a tiny mantra for the days ahead. At dawn, the forensic team would call with updates. The board would convene its independent auditors. Patricia would press further into vendor records. Thomas would prepare motions for emergency relief. They were moving toward the moment when a private betrayal would be exposed not only to the glare of colleagues and shareholders, but potentially to prosecutors who could decide whether sufficient evidence existed to bring criminal charges. Margaret sat with that possibility, not like a fantasy, but like a potential procedural fact. She imagined prosecutors poring over bank reconciliations, grand jurors weighing testimonies, the slow cadence of indictment. She also imagined the opposite, denials, legal maneuvers, the way privilege and money can make truth pliable. That tension, between the arithmetic of evidence and the contingency of process, would define the weeks ahead. She closed the blinds and let the city's night come in, not as a comfort, but as context. There was work to do, and the first steps had been taken. The recording had ripped a seam in a life that had been carefully staged. Now, in the light of documents and forensics, that seam would be pulled open and examined. Whether it would lead to board discipline, civil recovery, or a criminal referral was not yet certain. What was certain was the choice she had made, to convert discovery into accountability. If the story had a trajectory beyond that, the next moves would be made by auditors and prosecutors, by pleadings and hearings. For now, with the binder closed and the night stretching ahead, Margaret allowed herself a single steady thought. She would be ready. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs courage, and tell us in the comments, did Margaret do the right thing? The next call came at dawn, carried in a voice that sounded almost pleased in its quiet. The lead forensic accountant had completed an updated reconciliation. Every arrow on the spreadsheet now had a number. The 2.7 million transfer was one node in a larger network. Vendor accounts with matching deposits and withdrawals that ended, repeatedly, in an account traced to Vanessa Chun. Attached to the accountant's email were copies of internal emails authorizing certain consulting fees, expense reports submitted under Andrew's card with edited memos, and the altered beneficiary form from the safe deposit box. Margaret read the attachments at her kitchen table. The binder opened beside her like a small legal altar. The documents, taken together, did more than suggest motive. They mapped a route from corporate coffers to private benefit. Thomas, on the line minutes later, was quiet in the way lawyers are when the arithmetic of proof begins to line up with suspicion. "If the board agrees with this," he said, "they'll refer. And when a board refers, that's what gets a prosecutor's attention." They did not have to wait long. The independent auditors retained by Richfield reported the same anomalies in their parallel review. Their memo to the board concluded that there was credible evidence of potential misappropriation and recommended a referral to state prosecutors for possible embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The board voted to accept the recommendation. In a matter of days, the ethics dossier Margaret and her team had prepared, annotated and neat, moved from a private file on her table to a sealed case in the hands of investigators with the power to subpoena and indict. Prosecutor Emerald County's whiteboard was less cinematic than a courtroom drama. It was a functional room with folders and a prosecutor who, having seen many misconduct matters, now saw in Margaret's binder a series of corroborating records that fit criminal statutes. They requested bank records, subpoenaed emails, and issued preservation orders. Patricia's sworn affidavit detailing the chain of custody for the recording, the hotel receipts matched to corporate reimbursements, and the HR testimony about Vanessa's unusual access all became part of the file. The forensic accounting summary, color-coded and annotated, was copied into the prosecutor's brief. The beneficiary change, the timing of transfers, the repeated reimbursements for those independent hotels, and an email trail showing Andrew's authorization together formed a narrative prosecutors believed could convince a grand jury a crime had been committed. There were still barriers. Defense counsel would contest in court the interpretation of expense memos, the meaning of certain emails, the exchange between corporate prudence and personal benefit. But the prosecutor's office felt confident enough to present evidence to a grand jury. When the grand jury returned with an indictment, counts of embezzlement, insurance fraud for the beneficiary change that appeared to be part of the scheme, and conspiracy to defraud the company and Margaret, the legal shift was now public and consequential. Andrew was arrested 2 days after the indictment. It was not an ambush. The arresting officers were professional. They arrived with documents, read the charges, and escorted him from his home to a municipal booking. The man who had once stood at podiums discussing shareholder value now sat for booking photographs. The scene was matter-of-fact rather than humiliating. Margaret watched the photographs in the press release with a strange detachment. Despite everything, she did not wish this spectacle on anyone. She had built a case, not a public spectacle. At arraignment, the courtroom hummed with procedural noise, the judge's gavel, the clerk's reading of charges, the counsel's exchange on bail. Prosecutors argued for pretrial detention or high bail, citing the defendant's access to funds and a perceived flight risk. Defense pushed back on procedural grounds and offered stringent bail conditions. The judge set a substantial bond with conditions, surrender of passports, electronic monitoring, and restrictions on contact with certain witnesses. Andrew was released on bond but under tight court supervision. For the moment, he was not in a cell. That would change by the time proceedings concluded. The months that followed were measured and meticulous. Discovery produced thousands of pages, emails with phrases that no longer sounded benign when read in context, internal billing codes repurposed as cover, invoices that whited out the trail. Patricia's testimony, given in a neutral register, explained the steps she took to confirm the dates and the chain of custody for the recording. The lead forensic accountant took the stand and explained, in plain language, how a series of transfers and reimbursements, when traced by timestamps and authorization emails, showed a pattern inconsistent with ordinary business expense. Thomas coordinated with prosecutors on civil aspects, asset preservation motions and potential restitution, and ensured that Margaret's emergency orders prevented further dissipation of contested assets. Vanessa's role shifted as the prosecution deepened. Faced with the weight of documents that showed deposits to an account she controlled and internal communications indicating she had been inserted into expense items and travel, Vanessa negotiated with her counsel. She was not the focus the way Andrew was, but her name could not be erased from what the auditors had found. In a separate proceeding, she faced employment termination, civil claims, and a potential criminal referral. In the end, she agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced exposure, a sequence that allowed investigators to confirm certain authorizations without turning the trial into a spectacle of competing testimonies about personal relationships. The criminal case did not move by theatrics, it moved by layers. Subpoenas to banks produced wire confirmations with memos, phone records matched travel dates, and an email thread showed Andrew instructing an assistant to handle certain payments. That thread, prosecutors argued, undercut the claim that bookings were purely business. The beneficiary form, signed and dated in a narrow window after certain transfers, became a telling exhibit when paired with correspondence about future arrangements that mirrored phrases in the recording Margaret had found. Each exhibit amplified the others until the prosecutor's narrative was not an accusation based on motive alone, but a composite made of paper, pixels, and sworn statements. Faced with that composite, defense teams examined the seams and asked how much an ordinary jury might infer versus what the documents incontrovertibly proved. Trials are expensive and unpredictable. Prosecutors and defense counsel each assessed the likely outcomes. Ultimately, Andrew made a decision many executives in these cases make. He entered into plea negotiations. The terms were not telegraphed. They were hammered out in closed rooms where charges and potential sentences are weighed against conviction risks. Margaret was consulted through her counsel. She did not seek vengeance but wanted accountability that would protect assets and ensure restitution for losses. In court, the plea was succinct. Andrew pleaded guilty to 2 counts, conspiracy to commit fraud and an embezzlement charge tied to the diversion of corporate funds. The plea agreement included forfeiture of certain bank accounts and a sentencing recommendation that anticipated a custodial term, restitution, and forfeiture of unvested stock options as permitted by corporate clawback provisions and the settlement terms the company had negotiated. Prosecutors emphasized how the forensic trail, the beneficiary alteration timed to an option vesting, and the expense reimbursements supported the plea. Defense counsel framed the plea as an acceptance of responsibility for a limited set of actions, while preserving challenges to other potential civil claims. Sentencing was the day the story crossed from legal motion into consequence. Margaret sat toward the back of the courtroom, calm, composed, a quiet presence that attorneys often described later as measured. The prosecutor read a victim impact statement crafted to stick to facts. The monetary losses, the governance failures, and the ripple effects on shareholders and employees. Thomas read a short allocution for Margaret. Not one of invective, but of consequences felt. The professional setbacks, the need to rebuild, the personal cost of betrayal. Andrew addressed the court and offered an apology that was careful, his voice steady but measured. The judge, weighing the statutory guidelines, the plea agreement, the severity of the offense, and the need for deterrence, handed down a sentence, a multi-year custodial term, restitution to be paid from forfeited and recovered assets, and a period of supervised release thereafter. When the sheriff's deputies escorted Andrew from the courtroom to the jurisdiction's detention facility, the room's air changed in a way Margaret had not expected. It was not triumph she felt. It was an odd mix of closure and sorrow. 15 years of a life, shared dinners, speeches, the house they had bought, were being legally disentangled. But the key legal fact stood. The system had moved from inquiry to indictment to plea and then to incarceration. The man who had once framed her concerns as paranoia would now account, publicly and legally, for the choices that had set the chain of events in motion. The civil and corporate fallout moved in parallel. Richfield's independent review led to the board formally terminating Andrew's employment and enforcing clawback provisions on unvested options that, under the company's policies, could be forfeited for misconduct. The company cooperated with prosecutors and implemented new compliance measures, its council negotiated a settlement that included corporate governance reforms and restitution channels. Margaret's emergency orders remained in place long enough for Thomas to negotiate a divorce settlement that reflected recovered assets, enforcement of the prenup's reasonable protections, and a negotiated division for the remainder. She secured the Austen house she had wanted, an asset she intended to use both as a home and as a base for restarting her design work, and a multi-million-dollar recovery drawn from forfeited accounts and negotiated settlements. When the dust settled, the most visible change was not in the headlines, but in her days. The design studio that had been dormant now had a new name above the door, and Margaret, returning to the tactile work she loved, found solace in material selection and client meetings. Her first project after the settlement was modest by the measure of those who tracked net worth, an intimate renovation of a family home. But the work felt like reclamation. She started hiring again, building a small team that shared her aesthetic and her commitment to ethical business practices. There were clients who came because of her story, and clients who came simply because they admired her taste. She treated both with equal prudence. The legal aftermath continued to hum in lower volumes. Vanessa faced civil suits and a negotiated agreement that required restitution and professional redirection. She left the city quietly, her LinkedIn profile scrubbed of the job that had propelled her into the orbit of an executive. Richfield's stock took a measured hit during the scandal, but the company's transparency and the board's cooperation with authorities helped stabilize investor confidence. Margaret testified in a civil deposition and later in motions related to asset recovery. She did so with the same calm competence she now brought to client presentations. There were quieter moments, too. On a late autumn morning, Margaret walked through her Austen property and ran her hand along a newly installed oak door intended for a client's entrance. The grain of the wood felt like a material answer to a question that had been lodged in her chest for months. How do you go on after the person you trusted executes a plan to erase you? Her answer was not dramatic. It was ordinary. She rebuilt a business, renovated a house, reconnected with friends who had stood at a distance during the legal storm, and slept in a bedroom that had no secrets tucked in its closet. Public judgment, meanwhile, took its own paths. Some corners of social media posted quick takes about betrayal and karmic justice. Other corners debated whether the process had been fair. Margaret read none of it at first. She learned to let legal teams handle public statements. When she did agree to a short interview for a design magazine, she spoke about agency and documentation in practical terms. Keep receipts, save emails, know your contracts, yes. But the point she emphasized with quiet force was different. Keep your voice, she said, not as a slogan, but as a lived imperative. We sometimes forget that the records we make in life, emails,